Section 14 of the Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman by Mona Caird. 6. Phases of Human Development, Part 2. Sons of Bondswomen. We must transmit, being mothers, what we are to mankind. Charlotte Stetson. Two great dangers to the race are involved in the bondage imposed upon women. The suppression of sports or varieties has already been treated. We now come to the injury entailed upon men as the sons, husbands, and brothers of bondswomen. A man has been brought up from earliest childhood to regard a woman as of less importance than himself. He sees her trained to minister to his comfort and to make herself pleasing in his eyes. He finds the respectable British matron eager to see her daughters marry well. Does she not know, poor woman, that if they do not marry well, society offers them small chance of doing well in any other way? Among the classes for whom the man of the world would feel called upon to profess respect, the voices of duty and religion mingle with that of self-interest, in counseling submission, while in the class that he would openly despise, the necessity to earn a living and the dread of slaving at starvation wages provides a motive for the bargain which, according to popular incoherence, disgraces beyond redemption one of the parties to it, while it leaves the other a pillar of society. Is anyone so optimistic as to believe that from conditions such as these it is possible to produce a community wherein all the worst instincts of mankind shall not run wild? If it be true that character is the product of native impulse in combination with daily circumstance, what is the character that might be expected in the average man? Is he not almost foredoomed to corruption? What chance has he of escaping unharmed from such a conspiracy of destiny? Had it been the object of some untoward spirit to create a corrupt and desperate community, how could that evil genius have done it better than by placing one sex at the mercy of the other, and teaching both to regard the arrangement as ordained by God and sanctioned by man? Leaving the doctrine to do its work, we should find it capable in a few years of ruining the character of a company of saints, much more than that of a race of ordinary sinners. This must be so, even if influences were otherwise favorable. But so far from this, our social influences all conspire to the same disaster. In the struggle for a livelihood, existence for the majority is lacking in savor, unredeemed by that interest in the mere pageant of life, which may bring moments of happiness, even in the hardest lot. It is not too bold a thing to say that the mind of man once cultivated, he will see around him the paradise that he laments he has lost. For one paradise lost, he will sing 1,000 that he has gained. Without internal resources to brighten the dull ways of daily toil, the imperfectly developed human being, subject to all the burdens of civilization without enjoying its highest gifts, is liable to find only pleasures of the grossest sort attractive. He is thrown upon the mercy of the mere savage within him, whose appetites nothing in his home training or in the philosophy of the world seriously teaches him to control. Thus the plot thickens, and the hero of the drama of life finds himself attacked from every side. If he escape one foe, he is liable to fall into the power of another. There is so little to help him. Not only is the whole scheme of life inimical, but all its details bring contributions to his downfall. His nerves, and therefore his self-control and will force, have been more or less weakened by the exciting pressure of modern life, and his whole nature rendered by so much the less fresh and sound in its instincts. Granting all the advantages to be obtained from public school life, can it be considered as a good preparation for the battle of existence and the difficulties that are to follow? The mere minor customs of the time tend in the same direction. The perpetual stimulus of alcohol, moderate in quantity though it be, causing at least a harassment of the system and working in concert with the thousand circumstances of modern life that tend towards overexcitement and exhaustion. Boys in their school days begin to levy this lifelong tax. Tobacco soon demands its milder tribute, each payment being, perhaps, small in itself, but all helping to swell that big debt which the average man sets to work to incur, as soon as he has liberty to continue, on his own account and on a grander scale, the errors of his early training. Under this burden, which increases as a river swells with the tributes of tiny streams, he generally finds himself in middle life, a debtor, without hope of clearing himself of his liabilities. Morally, he also suffers, for worn-out nerves are poor servants to the will and the conscience. Moreover, the will has been weakened by incessant yielding to the desire of the moment. In his earlier years, he has enjoyed but few chances of companionship with girls whom he respects, because society discourages that good comradeship which is so essential to the development of a healthy feeling. Thence a false sentiment springs up, and men and women tend to forget that it is their common humanity, above all and first of all, that forms the ground of mutual interest. The accident of sex being at present allowed undue weight and dragged out of all proportion to the facts of existence. In consequence of this state of feeling and the customs that it engenders, the young man is too often deprived of the help and safety which the friendship of women might have given him in time of need. Look where he will. There are temptations and snares to his better self. Heredity is his enemy, but have not these very same forces been at work upon the temperament of his ancestors, weakening his own defenses, exasperating his primitive nature? Man, the creature of his conditions, out of which he is fashioned and compounded, body and soul, has small hope indeed of resisting the influences at work upon his character, from the cradle to the grave. Liberty being denied to a whole sex, what can be expected from the other but license? It is partly because the overwhelming difficulties of the situation are recognized, that little else is expected of them. The marvel only is that society has survived at all on such a system. To place the sexes in the relation of possessor and possessed, patron and dependent, is almost equivalent to saying in so many words to the male half of humanity, here is your legitimate prey, pursue it. The existence of the game laws regulates, but does not alter, the ultimate relations of sportsmen and their quarry. Neither do the laws of marriage change the fundamental facts in the relations of man to woman. They only render legal and respectable that in them which is most savage. The freedom, or rather the license, that has been accorded to men, to their own detriment, has obviously been obtained by encroaching on the liberties of women. What has been called liberty was, in fact, broadly speaking, impunity in aggression. The dual standard of morality proves this beyond question. Our laws at present express the sentiment of a society that loves to see its women helpless and imprisoned. When a small minority have embraced new views on this question, their position is one of peculiar difficulty, for their right and wrong are no longer the right and wrong of their contemporaries. While they continue to obey the popular view of duty, they are offending their own conscience, and this is, in its very nature, a tragic situation. But as soon as they attempt to act upon their convictions, they are met with outcries on all hands, not merely from the world in general, but from their nearest and dearest. Suppose, for instance, a woman holds that marriage ought not to confer proprietary rights on either of the partners. This seems to her husband a shocking and intolerable idea. He has married in the ordinary fashion, taking everything for granted as right and fitting, and the current standards as binding on both himself and his wife. He married with certain definite expectations, intending to fulfill what the same authority appointed as his duty, and he not unnaturally considers himself ill-used if these expectations are disappointed. But what can be said of the institution which allows him to possess power so tremendous over another human being? If a man were living in a community according to whose law he was the owner of slaves, his whole stake in life depending on them, it would be very hard on him, no doubt, if those slaves were to mutiny, and he were to be left penniless. Why should he, who is at least no worse than others, be thus picked out for affliction? He is honestly desirous of doing his duty by his slaves, as he conceives it, and he cannot understand why they insist on shirking their part of the arrangement. Yet one could scarcely inculcate it as a duty on the part of the slaves to remain in bondage, in order to fulfill the expectations which his country had raised. Nor can we, with any more fairness, preach to wives to fulfill all the expectations which our marriage laws and customs hold out to the husband. We must remember that as the livelihood of women depends mainly on marriage, the majority have very little more choice as to their status in life than the slave has, who is born of slave parents, even when the marriage is one of inclination. Footnote. The actual predicament of women in many Roman Catholic countries may be taken, roughly speaking, as a type of their position in relation to society as a whole. The real compulsion that underlies ostensible freedom of choice as regards entering either a cloister or a sphere are of about equal cogency. The position of women in Italy is an interesting study from this point of view. The feeling, says Seymour in his Pilgrimage to Rome, that the life of the cloister is the only safe and secure protection for an unmarried female, is carefully fostered by the parents in order to induce their daughters to remain in the cloister. It is no less carefully cherished and fostered by the priesthood to conceal the penetralia of conventional life. And so far is this carried that if a novice, having taken the white veil, should, at the conclusion of her novitiate, refuse to take the black veil, she would be regarded as a reckless and willful girl who preferred a life of exposure to the worst temptations in the world, to a life of holiness and peace in a nunnery. Her parents and relations would refuse to receive her, or if they did receive her, it would be as a fallen and unhappy one. She would be kept from contact with her other sisters. She would be removed out of sight, that no stranger should see her. Her name would never be heard in conversation. With such a prospect before her, as a matter of certainty, it ceases to be any cause for astonishment that the young novice should persevere and lay aside the white veil and assume the black, becoming a recluse for life. The daughter is as much regarded as provided for in life in the cloister as is a daughter in England when settled suitably in marriage, or a son in a preferment, and therefore we can well conceive the difficulties opposed by parents against all recessions from such engagements. All this supposes that the young female is free, that she has the opportunity or power to withdraw, and therefore all this applies only or chiefly to the novice, to whom the opportunity is nominally offered of withdrawing if she wishes. The truth is that she dare not accept this nominal offer, however much and anxiously she may wish it. The feelings of her own family and the state of public feeling impose an insuperable obstacle to her fulfilling her desires, and she passively resigns herself to her hard fate. It is not that she finds her novitiate a happy springtime, as some have imagined, nor is it that the other nuns, naturally anxious for some new companion to lighten the dull monotony of the cloister, weave all their arts to fascinate and ensnare the novice. It is not this that impels and precipitates the fatal step, but it is the impossibility of overcoming the obstacles arising from the feelings of her family and the tone of public feeling on the subject. And in exactly the same manner is the young woman in Protestant lands nominally free to refuse marriage and virtually compelled to accept it on almost any terms. Otherwise, penalties of all kinds await her, in consequence of the general organization of society in relation to her sex, and by reason of the tone of public feeling on the subject. End of footnote. The terms which bind the couple are compulsory, and such a marriage, under our present conditions, is analogous to, not identical with, a state of slavery willingly incurred for the sake of obtaining some greatly desired good, or of averting some dreaded evil. Yet the slavery remains slavery, however gladly it may be accepted. It is, moreover, generally accepted in ignorance. It is only day by day and year by year that the full significance of the so-called contract becomes revealed to the woman who has been carefully brought up without any knowledge of the world, or at any rate, without mental training which would enable her to draw a just conclusion from what she sees. Is it fair or even sane to demand that the so-called obligations of marriage shall be rigidly fulfilled in such circumstances? Honor does not require the fulfillment of engagements unless they are entered into with complete knowledge and without any sort of coercion, direct or indirect, or any penalty for refusal. Honor, however, does demand that we shall not take advantage of the assistance of popular opinion to enforce that which has not been agreed to under free conditions, and to which consent ought therefore not to have been asked. It has been urged even by those who admit that this bondage creates a low moral standard, that the removal of such bondage would be followed by a standard still lower. If this be the case, how is it that we come to be riding on the horns of this very awkward dilemma? As these articles have pointed out, we have to thank for this predicament the uneliminated savage in our Constitution, who scares us from the next important step of progress, preventing us from honoring the relation of man to woman, as we believe in our hearts it ought to be honored. We consent to degrade that relationship, lest it should be delivered over to our tyrants, to be degraded still more terribly. There is indeed a pathetic attempt to deny that these compulsory relations are debasing, and to act on the good old theory that the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. But even the staunchest supporters of our present system must see that if the savage element be not held in check by some means, both the evil and the difficulty of cure must go on increasing. After a certain time, the strength and life of the people must become exhausted, and then we shall be threatened with the fate that has overtaken so many nations after a certain stage has been reached. Decadence through corruption, or through failure to produce varieties of type. It is, in fact, inconceivable that a people can go on progressing while they continue to cripple half their numbers. A bird cannot fly long with a broken wing. It is significant that the flight of the creature so injured is not only halting, but it tends to return upon itself, to describe a painful circle, never making way, in spite of all its breathless exertions. The often cited fate of brilliant and apparently sound civilizations suggests significant reflections with this fact in view. Society still struggles on with its broken wing. On no account would it allow the wound to be healed, and if it be suggested that a steadier flight could be achieved by binding up the maimed member, our guides, philosophers, and friends point to the spasmodic movements as a proof of the bird's hopeless inability to move straight. We must not heal the injury because it has damaged the constitution of the creature to such an extent that a cure would create the utmost peril to the system. The cripple must be left to pursue its painful way until it sinks from sheer exhaustion. This, in fact, is the orthodox typical method of meeting all proposals for reform, and it has pursued us from ages beyond the reach of history. It is an argument which is often reinforced by another argument against the claims of women, which is still more remarkable. Its authors earnestly recommend desistance from all efforts in the direction of freedom, on the ground that so much improvement has been made as regards the position of women during the last 20 or 30 years. Mrs. Katie Stanton, who had evidently been much pestered with this baffling form of objection, gives an admirable illustration of its character. They tell us sometimes, she says, that if we had only kept quiet, all these desirable things would have come about of themselves. I am reminded of the Greek clown who, having seen an archer bring down a flying bird, remarks sagely, "You might have saved your arrow. The bird would anyway have been killed by the fall." End of section 14. Section 15 of the Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman by Mona Caird. 6. Phases of Human Development, Part 3. The Tyranny of Instinct. But the eternal world contains at once the evil and the cure. Shelley. In the movements of modern life, the supremely momentous question is whether we are to yield to the animal or to the human in our composition. That is to say, are we to consult what we are pleased to term the natural constitution, or are we rather to take counsel of that element within us, which even now desires an existence impossible to us, only because men have made it so? If the body were a rigid affair of mechanism, whose habits and needs were absolutely unmodifiable, so that, in hearkening to the human demands of our being, it were necessary to sacrifice the physical welfare, the race would, indeed, have but little to hope for. But this is far from being the case. The body can create for itself good habits and bad habits, needs which are purely artificial, yet as peremptory as the demand for food and air. It can, moreover, encourage a natural impulse to such an extent as to make its perpetual gratification a morbid necessity. On the other hand, it can emancipate itself from these claims, a process which, in the course of generations, might be carried to a far greater length than can be hoped for in one lifetime. The more common tendency, however, is to create needs, not to overcome them, and upon these created needs, to found customs and establish conclusions. The body can be brought into such a state by, for instance, immoderate habits of drinking, that to cease the indulgence would cause great suffering, while to continue, it means ruin to the health. Drunkards and the various victims of narcotics are extreme cases of such a creation of artificial requirements. When the case is an extreme one of this nature, and the indulgence is not a universal habit, but an occasional vice, nobody disputes that the demands thus engendered are unreal, or rather, that real as they are to the sufferer, they are induced by his own weakness, and do not constitute a primary condition of the race. The needs of the drunkard and the victim of plural are not taken into account in social arrangements. But let the habit be one in common practice, one that almost every man regards as indispensable. In that case, it must be treated seriously, as one of the final conditions of existence, although it may not be possible to deny that it plays havoc with the welfare of thousands and runs amok in society as a wild beast that knows no mercy. Such insane instincts, as a matter of fact, do exist among us, revealing their destructive ferocity in 1,000 forms of sin and suffering. Not a living soul has entirely escaped some injury, hereditary or immediate, direct or indirect, from their lordship. Yet we are instructed to regard them as scarcely modifiable factors of existence. They recall to memory the fabulous monsters of ancient story, whose ravages were wont to carry terror to the hearts of men, until at length some hero went forth to slay them. The monsters of today, unhappily, do not permit themselves to be slain so easily. They spit fire as of yore. They rend and pierce and tear, but they are no longer to be overcome in one sharp struggle, after the fashion of their more worthy ancestors. It is through the mysterious forces of heredity that the evil gathers such unholy strength. It seems as if nature had some mystic storehouse, wherein she garnered secretly, moment by moment, the 1,000 influences of daily life, the lurings and compulsions of circumstance, and that these, accumulating silently, became transmuted into living passions, imperious needs, which we are wont to call natural impulses, and to accept in the same resigned spirit as that in which the Germans welcomed typhoid fever as part of the divine scheme. There is something appalling in the knowledge that because a man's grandfather allowed evil habits to grow on him, that man is to be cursed all his life with some awful punishment, tormented perhaps with the strength of mere crude instinct entirely out of harmony with his real character, causing him infinite struggles, unless the worst thing happen, again through the existence of some hereditary weakness, and he surrenders the human side of him to the encroachments of the animal. It is equally appalling to realize that every man, woman, and child, stupid, weak, ignorant, as each may be, is busy forming the forces of heredity. It is not only parents of children who take part in this work. Parents of thoughts and of deeds are also called to the making of the world. Such facts, while adding to the sense of moral responsibility, must make clear the utter folly of accepting the leading characteristics of the average man of today as the final type of humanity. We have seen how social conditions have given encouragement to primitive passions, and it needs but little perspicacity to infer that the standard of what is a necessary indulgence of such passions is likely to rise very high in these circumstances, just as a man's idea of the moderate and necessary amount of smoking or drinking rises with the facilities for gratifying these tastes. A fixed opinion gradually grows up that a man, more or less, needs these luxuries, and universal custom has even gone the length of producing a strange idea among many that their health demands the use of alcohol, not as an occasional stimulus, but as a habitual prop to the system. Perhaps after a time, they actually do arrive at such a morbid state, and this applies, of course, not merely to alcohol. For one of the insidious dangers of these superstitions is that the artificially created needs become real ones after a while, constituting a sort of disease, which has to be propitiated by a form of food which exasperates the disease. If we are to judge by results, we must surely conclude that habits have grown up in society, which are at least as pernicious as those of the victim of chloral or of opium. Doubtless, if it became general to indulge in these drugs, our standard of what was necessary, or at any rate, of what no man could be expected to do without, would rise to the level that now regulates the supply of these slaves of habit. Just as an individual can found a robust dynasty of tyrants in his body and his soul, so can an entire race enthrall itself. And in this case also, as in that of the individual, the demoniac possession will not be regarded as disease, but as a normal state, which indeed it is, but not the healthy or the necessary one. When a man falls down in an epileptic fit, we conclude that he has something wrong with him. But if epileptic fits occurred by hundreds every day, and continue to do so persistently, the disease would soon cease to be regarded as a sign of anything abnormal. We might deplore the prevalence of epilepsy, but we should come to regard it as an accompaniment of life, and to smile at enthusiasts who suppose that society could exist without it. My dear sir, we should say, smoothing our mustaches, when you come to have a little more experience of the world, you will understand that human nature is always human nature, and that fits are a natural concomitant of, civilized existence. I assure you, my father and grandfather used to go under the table with them every night. This, of course, is going rather to excess. I should be the last person to encourage immoderate indulgence, but I have no patience with your faddists who are always preaching self-restraint. If a man's fits don't go beyond his quiet 6 or 7 a week, it doesn't do him a bit of harm. It's only when it comes on towards your 14 or 15 that it begins to knock a hole in his constitution. We should thus learn to distinguish between the moderate man and the reprobate who kept on having fits, in season and out of season. We should condemn, though in a more or less genial spirit, the jovial sinner who was a disgrace to the district, owing to the extraordinary frequencies of his paroxysms. It was really becoming difficult to catch him in a lucid interval. Reformers would spring up to cope with the sad prevalence of the evil, whose consequences in family life would be the theme of many eloquent orations. For what sort of comfort and happiness could be expected in a domestic circle, where the father of the family was perpetually falling down in convulsions, terrifying the children, scaring the neighbors, and letting loose in the peaceful precincts of home the avenging phantom of an epileptic past? Something parallel to this has, in fact, happened with regard to some of the savageries that run riot amongst us. We see and regret their results, but we believe the evil to rest upon natural and necessary impulses which only dreamers can hope to see, modified to any considerable extent. Such being our melancholy conviction, we feel it unavoidable to continue to offer as propitiation to the ravenous monster an entire sex, and so keep him in riotous health and spirits. As for our lopsided attempts at restraint, the monster only regards them as affording him a little healthy exercise. He has all society for a happy hunting ground. If, then, we find that the ferocity of primitive impulses creates heartbreaking evils, can we hesitate in pronouncing these passions to have gone far beyond the limit of the necessary? Had they not passed the limit of the endurable? Can we fail to see that their overindulgence has engendered in the race a morbid condition which may very well be compared to that of the opium eater? If it be true that a resolute rebellion against their tyranny brings punishment in its train, is not this exactly parallel to the vengeance taken on the slave of a nerve-destroying drug? But even if this be denied, on the ground that the taking of drugs is not a natural but an acquired instinct, it can surely not be doubted that it would be possible to modify the force of the oceanic brute, not merely by general cultivation of self-control, now a neglected department of education, but by the encouragement of desires which are more conducive to development and happiness. The average man appears to be pitifully lacking in mental resource. If he has not something to destroy, time is his enemy. If in this frame of mind, his forms of amusement are not more or less brutalizing, he has not the wisdom of society to thank. Her methods are all coercive rather than educating. Yet, we recognize that the teacher who seeks to touch the mind and soul by attacking the body belongs to the Dark Ages. We are beginning to understand that we can only eradicate a habit or weaken an instinct by altering the processes of the intellect, of the conscience, of the will, and finally, of the physical constitution. The enemy has to be met and fought within the man's own soul, not merely by laws from without. The real triumph is to destroy the tendency to evil, or the desire to practice at the expense of others what might in itself be innocent. We can only teach to any purpose when we have made the pupil willing to learn, and to this end his circumstances must conspire. There are in man many regions of the conscience as well as of the intellect still uncultivated. The elements of existence have to be remodeled in order to redeem these wastes. But to deny the possibility of redemption is to ignore the testimony of all history. The very fact that our conditions are so preposterous, so ruinous to all chance of a healthy moral life, is a ground for entertaining high hopes of human possibilities, when these conditions shall be more propitious. There are, says Maudsley, many inconsistencies of thought and character which might be brought forward to show how far men yet are from doing justice to their mental faculties by developing them consistently to the utmost of their capacities. It is not beyond human power, though it may, in its first steps, be terribly difficult to destroy the barbarous survivals that now desecrate the relations of the sexes. But that accomplished, even partially, through the might of growing opinion, a universal change of standard would become inevitable. Imagine a troop of schoolboys with a cage full of birds at their mercy. What sort of views would be likely to grow up amongst the boys as to their right to amuse themselves at the expense of the prisoners? Moral precepts would be in vain so long as the birds remained behind the bars. But release the captives, and the owners perforce cease their tyranny. In a short time, their conscience harmonizes with the changed conditions, and virtue soon begins to be manufactured out of necessity. A change of opinion is confusedly arising, even among the majority, who insist that no alteration of sentiment is called for. They wear their rule with a difference. Just as people will read fresh meanings into old religious doctrines, so there is a strong tendency to take a new view of human relations. In opposition to this more civilized feeling, many still point back to what are called the facts of social existence. The origin of those facts we shall find in man's absolute power over woman, and in the inevitable abuse of that power to his own and her age-long injury. Practical philosophy preached, and still preaches, The absolute necessity of these depredations, and the belief, otherwise expressed, became firmly fixed that the nature of man demands the martyrdom of woman. Thus we find the foundations of our great twin system of marriage and prostitution. It is often regarded as unfair to treat men as the only offenders. Women, it is urged, are not so often sinned against as sinning, and they are generally the first to point out to men the descent to Avernus. This may be true or false. Probably it is partly true, but the mere fact of womanhood does not provide an antidote against the moral poison that is generated by evil lives and evil thoughts. Men hand on their weaknesses to their daughters, as well as to their sons, and cruel is often the suffering caused by such a heritage, under the conditions of a woman's life. It is the system rather than the sex that deserves reproach. If the fault is really to be laid at the door of women, then it is because of the training they have received at the hands of their fellows. Their field of life having been ruthlessly curtailed, we must not be surprised if we find them trying to make the most of what is vouchsafed to them, and practicing the only permitted arts in a somewhat destructive fashion. In short, whichever may be the peccant sex, or whether or not both are equally culpable, the fact remains that the real first cause of the corruption is the position that one holds in respect to the other. To bicker over minor causes, to seek to weigh out blame with nicety, is merely to confuse the mind in the mazes of these intricate problems. Heap upon women all the reproach and leave men spotless, if so it be desired. The conclusion remains steady and unaltered, that men's rule and women's subjection lie at the root of all the evil and distress. That such results would follow from such antecedents might have been predicted a priori. We have long and painful experience to confirm such a process of reasoning. Whatever may be thought as to the amount of blame attaching to women in these matters, it is, however, generally the nature of men that is indulgently considered when there is a question of methods of reform. Women may be regarded as sinful and as leading others in the paths of sin, but we hear nothing about the demands of their nature, which makes transgression necessary or change impracticable. Whence this distinction may be gathered, that a man's delinquencies are required by his nature, a woman's detestable aberrations to be punished with all the scorn and ferocity of an outraged society. Yet, if women are equal to men in iniquity, how does it happen that they, too, have not imperious natures that must be indulged at all hazards? We can scarcely fail to see the absurdity of assuming a certain state of the human constitution to be the result of an eternal law, when all evidence points to that state as the result of man's own accumulated habits, by which he has been reduced to slavery. Probably, this slavery is often endured because the man has been persistently trained to think submission inevitable. There is no enemy so awe-inspiring as one's own despair of victory. If we are really to take human nature exactly as we find it, and provide respectfully for its manifold demands, heaven help our descendants. The imperious natures of our grandfathers called out for wine in such liberal quantities that they ended their repasts under the table. Thence the imperious nature of our gout. What is often called common sense is opposed to revolutions, even when directed against the tyranny of evil habits. When such habits engender rheumatism and consumption and heart disease, the sufferers have to bear their pains, for they have not yet found the means to thrust these penalties directly onto other shoulders. Vivisection seeks to accomplish this indirectly. But when the folly and wickedness that circulate in the blood break forth in the form of fierce passions, then their force may be expended to the injury of other human beings, who are plentifully provided by the foresight of society as its scapegoats. All pain and trouble thus are spared, for the moment, to the heir of the ages. He settles his account later on. It may take some time yet before mankind arrives at the point of understanding the meanness of thus thrusting suffering on others, which fate has apportioned for oneself. An age which sees nothing dastardly in the practice of torturing animals in the supposed interest of mankind is not in a condition to see that it is carrying out the same cowardly principle as regards certain doomed classes of humanity. Lecky speaks of the unhappy woman, of whom the respectable think, with an undisguised shudder, as the most efficient guardian of virtue. She remains, while creeds and civilizations rise and fall, the eternal priestess of humanity, blasted for the sins of the people. End of section 15.
Section 16 of The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman by Mona Caird. 6. Phases of Human Development, Part 4, The Human Element in Man. The word is well said to be omnipotent in this world. Man, thereby divine, can create as by fiat. Carlyle. The human race has arrived at a point in its development when the disturbance consequent upon its transitional condition begins to be severely felt. The inharmony between our civilization and our still unconquered barbarism becomes intolerable, and there is an outcry, not against the barbarism, but against the civilization. Men blame the civilized state for the evil that is caused therein by the savageries which they have failed to extirpate, and a cry is raised for a return to nature. Footnote 1. Nature is here used in the usual popular sense of primitive impulse and law, unmodified by human intelligence or moral development. End of footnote 1. And nature is always waiting eagerly, like a hungry beast of prey, to reclaim her own. She rejoices at the falling to pieces of the state, which had defied her incessant endeavor to undo it, in the voluntary surrender to the crude impulses which have always held the civilized in a state of siege. She triumphs in the stupendous waste of power and effort implied in this retracing of the steep uphill road that has been trodden by so many weary feet for so many troublous centuries. The fruitless agony and toil of Sisyphus, who has to watch the huge stone that he has so painfully thrust to the summit of the hill, blundering stupidly down again to the lowest point that its idiot weight unswervingly suggests. This is a sight after nature's own heart. In the progress from stage to stage of life, there come inevitable epochs of confusion and darkness. Who does not know that the paths of development are full of shadowed places? Man is naturally impatient of such obscurity. He hates to grope. He prefers to turn his steps backwards. He indolently justifies the cruelties of life, the torture of the weak by the strong, the rule of man over woman, the oppression of animals by mankind, by the authority of nature. It does not disturb him that the existence of the state as such depends upon a departure from nature. Throughout the universe, he urges, the same eternal law holds sway. Let not the weak, above all, let not woman, seek to evade it. But that is exactly what every progressive being has to do if he wishes to avoid degeneration. That is what the merest vegetable has to do if it is to escape the atavism that sets in as soon as it has to resign itself to natural processes. All its complexities of structure, the glorifications of its original forms and organs, disappear, and it reverts to a weedy, undeveloped growth struggling for standing room, with a host of unkempt brothers in adversity. Nature has no mercy on those who yield themselves to her dominion. She bids the very flowers of the field to bring forth millions of seeds, that one may survive. She raises myriads of strong young lives, where there is no possibility of their continuance. Lives of plants, lives of men, it is all one, full of yearning and the mysterious will to live, yet foredoomed to slow processes of decay. In opposition to the widely accepted theory that whatever is natural is always right, it would be almost safe to assert that whatever is natural is certain to be wrong. It is unquestionably by becoming less and less natural that the human being becomes more and more tolerable. It is by presenting to the imagination a new method of diverging from the tame and barren wastes of nature unredeemed that a new step of progress is begun. There has been a very strong tendency of late to an entirely opposite view, although those who hold it do not make even an attempt at consistency, for they profess no belief, after all, that society ought to return to entirely natural conditions, which would commend the adventurous highwayman and the sturdy housebreaker to the support of a wise government. There are, however, some who go even to this length, holding that we suffer from over-civilization, and that it is folly to protect the weak against the strong, since this policy confuses natural selection and enfeebles the race. They are prepared to defy the fact that in a community where each man had to be perpetually on the defensive, he would have leisure for very little else, so that art and industry must languish. Then nature would have a gala time of it. The intelligent mechanic, whose conversation with her father Emma Hooker Woodward records, perceived plainly how entirely artificial was the condition induced by education in any form, for when asked why he opposed the act that brought it within the reach of the poorest, his answer was, "I go agin it on principle, sir, not because of its unconstitutionality, but because it's unnatural. Ignorance is natural," he said. "We was born ignorant and ought to be kept so." The intelligent mechanic was only more logical and dauntless in his application of the principle than others who hold the same creed. Either then we must take primitive nature for our guide, or we must choose a gentler sovereign. In the second case, we should obey nature only when her crude compulsion proved too strong for the resistance of weaklings, enervated by the centuries of obedience which our ancestors have devoted to the barbaric goddess. In defying her power, on the other hand, we should make progress in the human direction, adding in some sort to the creation as an artist adds to it, who brings form and being out of inchoate material. There is no question more difficult for man to answer than what is good or what is evil. It is utterly false to assert that every man knows in his heart, in each case, the right from the wrong. At critical moments, the power of early training and the prejudices of his race assert themselves as oracles, unless their exact opposites have usurped their functions through a violent reaction. But if, in particular cases, the decision be difficult, there is a general analogy between what we may call good and that which is, in its essence, organizing or creative. Order, balance, form, method, life, these, in the sentient world, are beneficent, while disorder, aimlessness, formlessness, disruptiveness, incoherence, death, stand on the other side as evil. Now, nature, in the sense of primitive impetus, is the high priestess of all that is fortuitous and incoherent. Imagine for a moment the career of one who really allowed her guidance unresisted, and imagine the still more appalling fate of a whole society which accepted her counsels without question. In such a case, almost inconceivable, the man and the race must instantly undergo a process of disintegration, till reduced to their original raw material. They would suffer the moral death which they courted. Of course, good and evil are terms relative to human consciousness. The race progresses in its conception of good. In a healthy state, the creative forces are ever busily at work. They form and fashion and sustain, showing a marked contrast to the decadent condition when everything grows slack, falls apart, slips back towards chaos. If a man is to extend the limits of his universe, he has to build up a larger and more creative consciousness. This can certainly never be done under the guidance of primitive natural impulses. Man has to escape from the vicious circle of these, or to remain a prisoner forever in a narrow dungeon. An image of an ideal human soul might perhaps be found in that masterpiece of ancient art, the Pantheon, whose serene magnificence inspires while it soothes the imagination. Its vastness is filled with infinite riches of subordinate beauty, sustaining without disturbing the splendor of the great temple, through whose stupendous and shadowy dome the blue heaven is seen by day, and at night the stars look down. Life may be to a man a temple of this magnificence, or the most wretched of hovels, exactly as he permits the enslaving or the liberative forces of his being to obtain the mastery. Our present life in the heart of civilization is a fierce struggle between these elements, between the original idiocy of savage appetite and the acquired wisdom of less material aspiration. We of the 19th century are at once too civilized and too barbarous to rest content with the half-animal, half-human standards that form our social organization. The human in us is strong enough to be wounded and outraged by the barbarity wherein we are still plunged, but we are not sufficiently human as yet to insist on the extirpation of that savage basis to our existence. Not a breath is drawn by the novelist of the race, which is not drawn involuntarily at the expense of pain or sacrifice to some other being. It is scarcely possible for any one to escape this curse which rests upon the human family. Were we more wholly savage, we should feel no pain in these conditions. The beast of prey probably finds life very satisfactory. He is not tormented by the thousand incongruities, inequalities of development in the individual nature, and in that of the race, which disturb so cruelly the life of the civilized. The more we develop, the more keen will be the anguish that we shall suffer from these survivals, but the more broad and exquisite our power of enjoyment. All change in the direction of greater complexity has, seemingly, to be accomplished through bitter struggle, and often through sin and failure and humiliation. This conflict is the secret of half the pain of life. Thus, in an age called materialistic, we are forced back with stronger impulsion than ever to believe or to hope in some power that is formative and coherent beyond and in man's own soul, or whatever we may choose to call that which we all more or less imply by the latter word. This soul gives to man the only hold which he has over the formation of his conditions, and the only means of influencing his fate. Through the working of thought and the masonry of will, the whole fabric of life is rebuilt. Creed and usage are transmuted atom by atom. An idea is a soul that creates for itself a body, and that body may eventually swell into a new social order, nay, into a new world. Thus considered, nature does not stand apart from man, for man, aspiring, progressive, victorious over primal impulse, is still a part of nature, and obedient in a higher sense to her dictates than he ever was in the infancy of the race. So that if we regard nature in this wider sense, as including all that the universe contains, or all that the powers of man can ultimately perceive or command, he is not in real revolt against her when he ceases to be a half-redeemed savage. Nature will not, in the long run, punish him for such emancipation of the God within him from the idiot who has carried on for so many ages his senseless rule. She will acknowledge and bow to the divinity. She has shown her approbation of man's progress in 1,000 ways, and in ways most unexpected. The man who is the outcome of civilization, with all the evil conditions that he has therein to contend with all the 1,000 foes to health that surround him in the restless life of modern communities, that man is yet stronger physically than the savage who has lived what we call a natural life from his infancy, and has a long line of ancestors who so lived behind him. The nervous force in the savage, while it has endured fewer shocks, has received less cultivation. It is in nervous organization that the civilized are more complex, more highly wrought, more lords of themselves. Thus, while the latter are, it would seem, incomparably more capable of pain than are their untutored brothers, who undergo ordeals that would be torture to ourselves with scarcely a sign or a groan, yet if it be a question of endurance of hardship over a long period, when courage of what may be called the nervous kind is required, then the civilized man lasts out where the savage succumbs almost immediately. His actual physical strength is less than that of the civilized in such conditions. He seems to stand to the educated, more complex example of the race, as a straggling weed stands to a cultivated plant, whose qualities have been improved by intelligence and art. Civilized man suffers indeed from his own follies, from the persistence with which he lives and forces others to live, in circumstances which every handbook of medical science assures him are inimical to body and mind. Yet, with all those easily removable disadvantages, the general education of nerve and mind that he has received has ended by producing a more physically efficient human being who has not been made to pay for spiritual advance by bodily degeneration. It is not spiritual advance, but spiritual blindness that he has had to pay for. It is a fact full of hope and significance that sane, steady mental activity of any kind, so long as it be not carried on under conditions of anxiety or pushed to wild excess, has a life-giving effect upon the body, tending to the balance and regulation of all its forces. All this tends to show that the dictates of primitive nature are not, by any means, the best guides to physical well-being. And if this may be said of the savage, whose surroundings are in harmony with such promptings, how much more must it be said of the civilized man, whose conditions clash so perilously with the non-social passions? Can one not foresee possibilities of human development beyond anything that has hitherto been dreamt of by man? Instead of physical degeneration, in consequence of the more highly organized life, is there not every promise of indefinite improvement, even in physical powers, probably in length of life and in prolongation of youth? These things follow if the others be true. It may appear utopian to expect so much, but so would have seemed a prophecy of the conditions of our present state, with all its troubles, to the most hopeful of our ancestors. As for the change being impracticable, changes have always been impracticable until they took place. Let not that dismay us. It will be said that such standards in hopeless opposition to the strongest impulses of the race are absolutely useless when we have to deal with complex social problems. Human nature, as it now is fashioned, through whatever causes, is too fierce an animal to be tamed thus by means of transcendental principles. A man cares not how he came by his passions. All he wants is to gratify them. But this is not true. It is the perennial mistake of what we call the practical mind. History is a tissue of transcendental principles solidified into national religions, aspirations, policies, laws, conventions, revolutions. From the day when human beings formed into communities, they began to fashion for themselves standards which referred them to some object more or less raised above that of mere selfishness. The idea of the tribe gave a stimulus to sentiment not self-directed. From the beginning, it is almost safe to say, there has been a religious element in human society, different from that mere terror or desire to propitiate an unseen foe, generally at the expense of some weaker brother, which is so often called by that name. And it is a striking fact that for the sake of this religion, men have shown themselves able to defy the most powerful instincts of their nature. There is no normal propensity that is really beyond control, even in the present excited condition of human propensities, with all heredity and circumstance at their back. The authority has only to be strong enough, and mankind desires nothing better than to obey. At the command of one man, perhaps dead centuries since, whole nations order their lives. Some prophet whose very existence is so enveloped in clouds of legend and fable that the man himself seems scarcely more than a fable, can hold in thrall vast lands and populations, century after century, promise, threaten, command, dictate beliefs, actions, abstentions, to millions of his fellows. At his voice calling forever across the ages, natural instincts crouch down in submission, and passions subside. The animal is conquered, and the man is born. Once more, mankind is not the slave of primitive instinct, except when mankind so wills it. It is not instinct, but emotional belief that has moved the world. Instinct has troubled, harassed, and often unfashioned that which human faith and mind and sympathy have built up. But it has not played the leading part, or we should not now be in a position even to discuss the matter. We should all be scalping our enemies round some forest fire, and employing what faint glimmers of intelligence we possessed to add to the extremity of their tortures. The world is ruled through the creeds of mankind, and those creeds are woven, strand after strand, by the ceaseless efforts of individuals, most of whom are unconscious that they are thus plying the immortal business of the fates. The end. End of section 16. End of The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Woman by Mona Caird.